Alright, so far we've covered energy, food chains, food webs, carbon cycle, water cycle, population size, biotic factors, abiotic factors, and now we're going to continue on to how those factors will affect primary succession, secondary succession, and the greenhouse effect. If you remember, an ecosystem is a community interacting with the environment. The environment, however, isn't stable. It changes depending on what's living in it. You've seen it yourself. You live in your environment, or say if you've lived in a small town and you get development occurring, you see changes in the environment there. What used to be a field is suddenly paved over, and you build a new apartment building, a parking lot on it. You've seen change there. Life has changed the environment. Same way in nature, life will change the environment. So let's take a look at how things generally progress. Before there was life, there was the environment. Say, bare rock. Volcano spews out magma in the bottom of the ocean. That builds up until that a tiny little tip of rock peaks up over the ocean, and now you have the beginning of a small island. If you build up enough lava, mount enough magma, that island grows bigger until you have an island, but it's desolate. There's nothing living out there. Now, over time, you might have life coming into it, to that rock, starting off with the pioneer species like lichen and mosses. They, especially lichen, are able to extract nutrients from the environment, from the air, and also break down the rock around it for various substances that it needs to grow. And by that process, as you're breaking down the rock, you're creating smaller and smaller rocks. And another name for that would be soil. So those pioneers are creating soil. So now, once you've built up a small layer of soil, that allows other plants to start growing on there. Not large plants, of course, since there's not a lot of soil, but just small plants start growing. Those plants grow, die, and keeps on building up the soil layer, so shrubs and herbs can start growing there. Well, more like herbs. Next stage would be shrubs, as you keep on that cycle of life, of birth, life, death, decay. That builds up the soil, and all this time you're also breaking down the rock in the environment as well. So the soil layer keeps on thickening until you can support trees, and that would be your climax community, a stable final community that has lower biodiversity. They are the best competitors for their particular ecosystem, so they exclude everything else, and the only way that you can get new pioneer species in a greater diversity is by the death of some of these climax organisms. What we have just described here is called primary succession. Now, there's a second type of succession called secondary succession. This is similar in primary, where you start off with barren areas, and then you have small pioneer plants growing there. Those die, grow, die. That provides the area and nutrients for some secondary growth, and then the larger species start growing in, even larger, slower growing, and then you have the climax community. What differs here, though, is you are not starting from bare rock. Usually, secondary succession occurs when you have a disturbance, such as a fire, forest fire, earthquake, Mount St. Helens erupting, whatever's happening, it's knocking down a portion of that climax community. And that frees up space for less competitive species, or we should say species that aren't as good as competing for the space, but they are much faster growing. Usually the best competitors are slow growing. So you have the first pioneer species coming in, recolonizing the area. They grow quickly and have their moment in the sun, literally. And then the next stage that aren't as fast growing but still can outcompete the pioneer species. Say they grow a little taller, a little bushier, so that they are able to reach more sun. Eventually the pioneers will be edged out by the second wave, and that process repeats itself with larger and larger and generally slower and slower growing plants, and the animals that live in those communities, until you reach the climax community again, and that is stable until you get another disturbance. That again is secondary succession. Now there are other ways that life can affect the environment, not just through succession, but say by affecting the carbon cycle. For example, we humans tend to affect the amount of carbon dioxide that is released back into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, and that affects the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and can lead to what has been discussed, the greenhouse effect. The way a greenhouse works is that high energy wavelengths are able to pass through the outer layer. In the case of the Earth, that would be the atmosphere, and some of that energy is reflected and bounces right back out in space. However, some of that energy is absorbed by the ground and then re-radiated in lower energy forms, and that lower energy is then absorbed by the atmosphere. It can't pass through the atmosphere anymore, because the wavelength is too low. It can't penetrate. So instead, the atmosphere absorbs it, and then once it's absorbed as heat energy, and that heat is then stored by the atmosphere until the environment is cooler than the atmosphere, such as during the nighttime. Then the atmosphere re-radiates that heat in all directions, some of it into space, but a lot of it is reflected or radiated back to the ground, and that warms the layer between the atmosphere, the outer layer, and the ground, so it keeps the temperature warmer and habitable for us, which is a great thing. It's just that the problem is, if you do too much absorption and not enough reflection, temperature goes from cool to warm to where we're comfortable to the hot and very hot regions, because we're not losing enough of that energy into space, because we're absorbing more than we need to. So the take-home message of this particular section is life changes the environment, and in turn the environment determines what life can survive in it. So let's take care of our environment so that we can continue as a species to survive. Because barring any catastrophe, the planet will continue to exist in this universe for billions of years. We, as a species, however, aren't quite so stable. Alright, take care. Take care of yourselves, take care of your planet, and let's hope that we can continue on. Good day.